There are a lot of elements in this universe that I don't quite understand, and I often find myself spending hours just thinking about them. These questions range from big ones like, what is the purpose of my existence, to really pointless ones like, will my crush ever text me back? But if there is one element that I never even tried to understand, then it has to be my relationship with my father. Yeah, that took an unexpected turn. And it's not because he's some peculiar or mutant version of humans, but like every other traditional Indian father-child bond, ours was a little, what do you call it? What do you call it when there is lack of communication accompanied by a constant need for validation, a spoonful of difference in opinions, and a dash of approval issues? Let's just call it a recipe for complicated. Growing up, I often found myself wishing I were a boy. Not because I wasn't doing a great job at being a woman, that's besides the point, but because I thought that if I were a boy, then my father would have someone in this house that he could relate to. For a while we grew up learning about bras and sanitary napkins, worrying about our hair and the wings of our eyeliner, the best advice that my father could give was to not give any at all. And I can imagine how dissatisfying that must be for a man who aces at unsolicited advice. But as we both grew older, we found other things that we could do together, like eating dinner, taking walks, silently. Both of us, we always lacked words to tell each other how we felt. Either words did more harm than good, or they just weren't good enough. Little did I know that I did not need words to understand him. All I needed was an open heart. I remember going home on vacation, my mind preoccupied with this nonsensical fight I had with one of my closest friends, and no sooner than I entered home, I realized that my father was not just his usual cranky self. He seemed a bit different to me this time, as though he had aged a lot since the last time I saw him. As usual, he was getting irritated at the little things, and all I could think of was ways to not cross him. There wasn't much scope for interaction anyway. Our topics of conversation included, let's see, food, mom, food that my mom makes, and that's about it. Even so, I found myself at the receiving end of his irritation more times than I could tolerate. So by then I just gave up. I resorted to binge watching Netflix and rereading my favorite novel for the 5th time. But then one day, as I was heading out of the house for my evening walk, I overheard my father talking to someone on the phone in his room. This conversation sounded familiar. The door was slightly ajar so I could see him. He was talking to one of his closest friends, trying to resolve a misunderstanding. As each moment passed and his temper grew higher, he seemed more and more helpless. And that's when I realized that my father, a 50-year-old man, was going through something that I was a few days ago. He looked worried. He seemed stressed. And it's not that I never saw him stressed before. What with his work, putting up with us, crazy family version 1,000,000, he'd lose his mind every once in a while. And I would never understand that. But this was different. And I felt a sharp ache in my chest. That misunderstanding between my father and his friend suddenly made me realize that maybe there's more to my father's life than I ever tried looking at. For me, he was Iron Man, quite literally. But now I could see in him a soft-hearted person, worried about losing someone he cares so much about. And my heart warmed up to him like never before. I always loved him no matter what, but now I could empathize with him. And to find a little bit of you in someone else, that meant the world to me. As he got off the phone, I was still standing there. He looked up at me with a question mark on his face. I walked up to him. I still had no words. I didn't know what would make a 50-year-old man feel better. But I did what I would do for anybody who was upset. I placed my palm on his head and ruffled his hair. I hugged him tight and stayed there, with my arms wrapped around him and my face on his chest. A tear rolled down my cheek, but being the Iron Man's daughter, I pulled out of the embrace and turned away so that he wouldn't see me cry. Sometimes the people we love become invisible to us, much like our habits, and we lose the chance to communicate, to understand them, and to show them that we love them too. Who knew that all it would take to fix the recipe for complicated was a teaspoon of empathy and understanding? As I was walking away, my father called me from behind. "Chalo beta, aaj walk par chalte hai." I smiled and said, "Haan papa." And just like that, we went for a walk, like we always did. Still silent, but now I held his hand, like I used to when I was about 6 years old. And I knew then that my father, the Iron Man, whose temper is at a constant high, does have a heart. A heart of steel, but a heart nonetheless. Thank you.